saw that after the Cold War, the behavior not just of the United States, but Europe obviously began to change after the Cold War, and this was quite natural to a large extent because the bipolar world order had been replaced by a unipolar world order. Now, the different international distribution of power in the 1990s and 2000s were, however, very different than they are today. So, in your opinion, though, how has the shift in towards a multipolar distribution of power impacted what should be effectively the rules of the international system? Thinking more about how what the U.S. can achieve and in terms of how it has to act.
Let me just say that the polarity of the system, whether you're in a unipolar, a bipolar, or a multipolar system, it matters enormously. I was born and came of age in the Cold War, which was a bipolar world. It was the United States versus the Soviet Union. And then, of course, in 1989, maybe 1991, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, we went from bipolarity to unipolarity. And that was just a huge change. One cannot underestimate how much that affected international politics. And I would note that one of the problems is that most people today who are involved in the policy process or involved as commentators came of age during the unipolar moment, not during the bipolar moment or the bipolar era of the Cold War. And they got used to a situation during unipolarity where the United States and its European allies were extremely powerful and had all sorts of leverage all around the world. There were countries like China and Russia and Iran and North Korea, of course, that were unhappy with that situation, but there was not much they could do about it because there was a unipole, that was the United States, and it was backed to the hilt by the Europeans. But what happens, in my opinion, around 2017, we can argue about exactly when the world went from unipolarity to multipolarity, but we moved out of a unipolar world into a multipolar world. And it's very important, Glenn, to understand that this is the first time since 1945, before the Cold War, that we've been in a multipolar world. And a multipolar world is different than a bipolar world. A bipolar world is a rather simple world because you have two great powers, they're face to face, and they, in a very important way, kind of divide up the world between themselves. That's an oversimplification, but it sort of gets at the essence of what's going on in bipolarity. But in a multipolar world, like the one that we live in, you have three different great powers, and you also have a host of major powers, countries that are not quite great powers, but wield a lot of influence in the system. And India would fit in this situation or in this category. So we're now in this multipolar world. But the problem is that we have all these policymakers and pundits and policy analysts who grew up in unipolarity, and they're used to thinking of the world in terms of unipolarity. And many of them still think that the United States is Godzilla and that it can use its economic leverage and its military might to get its way wherever it wants. But that world has gone away. And you're now talking about, from an American perspective, dealing with the United States, dealing with Russia and dealing with China, two great powers. And then you have to deal with countries like India, countries like Turkey, countries like Iran. There are a lot of other important players in the system that you have to deal with. So it's a very complicated world. And also in this world, America's power has diminished, not in an absolute sense. Economically and militarily, we've grown more powerful over time. But relative to the other states in the system, we've lost power. The United States now faces a peer competitor in China. The China that the United States faces today is fundamentally different than the China it faced in 1990 or the China that it faced in 2000. And therefore, the United States has to deal differently with China today than it has in the past. And again, I think most American policymakers and policy analysts and pundits haven't really come to terms with that. They're just limits to what we can do, we meaning the United States. And really, it's not just the United States, it's the United States and the West. So this is the world that we're in today is just fundamentally different than the world that most people who are in the policy process these days came of age in.
Well, realists tend to differ a bit on what order is most stable. I was always a bit critical of the stability in the bipolar system, simply because if there's two major powers, one side loses, the other side gains, and it sets everything for sharp and zero sum. But I also was of the idea that if you have a third pole or fourth pole, that if A and B weaken each other, then C will come off and be much stronger. So in the 19th century, had the British and the Russians going against each other, and suddenly you have America, Germany, Japan, all these other new centers of power emerging. But how do you make sense of what's happening now? That was the United States and Russia, India, China, because we just had this meeting at the SCO, and it looked like Trump, he had the right instincts for a while. He more or less repeated a Kissinger caution and that we should not push the Russians into the hands of the Chinese. But what happened with India, though? This very strange actions which were made, that this punishments and even humiliation of the Indians, which made them align themselves much closer with this two other Eurasian giants.
Well, if you look at what the Trump administration is doing with regard to the alliance structure that it's trying to set up or not set up, it makes no sense at all from a balance of power perspective. It's very important to start by emphasizing that China is a peer competitor of the United States. There's really only one great power in the system that can give the United States a run for its money, and that's China. China is a formidable opponent of the United States, both economically and militarily. So if you're in a system where China is your principal concern, and you want to contain China, you want to contain China's rise. This is not to argue that you want to start World War III against China, but you want to prevent China from dominating Asia. You then, excuse me, Glenn, you then want to have good relations with Russia, and you want to have good relations with India, because you don't want them on the Chinese side of the ledger. But what the Trump administration has done by continuing the war in Ukraine and treating the Russians quite badly, despite what happened in Alaska, is in effect continue to push the Russians into the arms of the Chinese. And now what's happened is that as a result of putting 50% tariffs on India and saying all sorts of terrible things about India, Trump has driven the Indians into the arms of the Chinese. So as we recently saw at the SCO meeting in Tianjin in China, the Indians, the Russians, and the Chinese are all becoming the best of friends, which again is not in the American national interest. What the Americans should want is a situation where India, Russia, and the United States are the best of friends. But exactly the opposite has happened. This is just not in our strategic interest. And one can only scratch his or her head and ask, what do the Americans think they're doing? Or to put it more pointedly, what does President Trump think he's doing? It's a gross violation of balance of power logic. We live in a multipolar world. The Trump administration believes to a person that China has to be contained. Well, if you believe China has to be contained, pushing the Russians and the Indians into the arms of the Chinese just makes no sense at all. And you can take this even further, Glenn. You can talk about countries like Iran and countries like North Korea as well. What we see happening here is that the Russians, the Chinese, the North Koreans, and the Iranians have all come together to, in effect, balance against the United States. The Europeans, who, of course, work with the Americans on the Iran issue, the Europeans have now pushed for snapback sanctions on Iran. As you know, with the JCPOA, the agreement between Iran and the United States, China, Russia, Germany, France, and Britain, that JCPOA agreement in 2015, we took sanctions, all sorts of sanctions, off of Iran. Most in theory, not in practice. But anyway, the argument was that if one member of that group decided to put snapback sanctions, to put the sanctions back on Iran, everybody would go along with that. Well, the Europeans want to put snapback sanctions. They want to put the sanctions back on Iran. And the Russian foreign minister, Chinese foreign minister, and the Iranian foreign minister have just issued a statement saying they consider these snapback sanctions illegal, wrong, and counterproductive, and they're not going to pay any attention to them. So what you see here is that unified front to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons in 2015 has broken down. And the Iranians, the Russians, and the Chinese are working together. And in fact, the Russians and the Chinese are helping the Iranians build up their defenses for another possible attack from Israel and the United States. So if anything, U.S.-Iranian relations have deteriorated, making it more difficult to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons, and making it more likely that the United States will end up attacking Iran again, which is not in our national interest. We should have good relations with Iran. We should be going to great lengths to get help from the Russians and the Chinese to prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons. But instead, we're cutting in the other direction, and we're pushing the Iranians, the Chinese, the Russians, and the North Koreans together. And of course, just a word or two about the North Koreans. If you noticed, when they just had this big celebration this past week in Beijing, celebrating the end of World War II in Asia, North Korea's leader, China's leader, and Russia's leader, they were all there together, arm in arm, celebrating the victory. So you can see very clearly what's happened here. We've driven these four countries, China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, closer together, which is not in our interest. And now we've pushed the Indians into that same arrangement, into that same coalition. This makes absolutely no sense from an American point of view.
But that was a common warning. Warning, though, in the 1990s against unipolarity because, well, they said it would do two things. One, it would exhaust the resources of the United States and the political West, but it would also incentivize other rising powers to collectively balance the West because in the unipolar order, in order to be only one center of power, it makes sense to contain all other regional powers, but in a multipolar system, it only encourages collective balancing. So, for example, encouraging India not trade with Iran just means that Iranians will be more dependent on China. In, I think it was 2012, we had Hillary Clinton arguing that the U.S. should slow down or try to break up the Eurasian Economic Union because it institutionalized too much Russian influence over Central Asia. It was also cited as a reason, or by many as a reason why toppling the government in Ukraine in 2014 became a key objective. But if Russia doesn't have influence in Central Asia, then China's influence will grow out of proportion. So the whole idea of having the system working towards a non-natural equilibrium appears to be undermined. I mean, even in Europe, why would it seems once you shift from unipolarity to multipolarity, having Germany and France have better relations with Russia would be preferable, wouldn't it, than having now, as we see now with the SEO agreements being made, all this gas which was supposed to fuel Europe instead going to China. So Russia also becomes more dependent on China. It just seems that some of this should be common sense, but we're not really doing anything towards this end. But do you think Trump appreciates that it is some multipolar system? Because he recently now tweeted out that Russia and India has been lost to China, but the whole point of the Russians and Indians isn't that they want to align under Chinese leadership to go against America. They see China as being the main partner to work towards a multipolar system where they're independent centers of power. But nobody wants to join a Chinese bloc. I mean, against America. I think they're more, instead of going against America, they want to go against the American hegemony. But that's two very different things. So do you think Trump sees the world as being bipolar then? Because I have a hard time making sense of some of these decisions being made.
Before I answer that question, Glenn, let me just make one quick comment on what you said about our policies, American policies or Western policies during unipolarity and what they mean for the multipolar world we're now in. I think the best example of a foolish policy during unipolarity that's come back to bite us in multipolarity is NATO expansion, especially NATO expansion into Ukraine. As you know very, very well, in April 2008, we made the decision the West made the decision, NATO made the decision to bring Ukraine into NATO. And we've doubled down on that decision at every point since then. And the consequences here are just disastrous for all concerned, as you were pointing out. But we had a great deal of hubris during the unipolar moment. And this is more true of the United States than it was of the Europeans. But the Europeans were willing to go along with the United States. And this was especially true of the British. And we collectively thought that we could run the world, that we had the wind at our back. And if other countries didn't like it, we would just shove things down their throat. This is how we approach NATO expansion. We understood from the get-go that the Russians were opposed to NATO expansion. But in 1999, we shoved it down their throat. In 2004, we shoved the second big tranche down their throat. And then we thought we could shove the third big tranche, which would include Ukraine and Georgia, down their throat in April of 2008. And of course, it didn't work out. And it is made for a terrible situation. One could argue a catastrophic situation in Europe in the multipolar era. But I just wanted to sort of add to what you said. All right, on Trump, a very interesting question. You want to remember, when Trump comes into office, this is January 2017, his administration, in the very first year they are in power, introduces the word multipolarity into the national security dialogue in the United States. The word multipolarity is not present in the Obama administration. And it's President Trump who talks about multipolarity. And they talk about the Chinese and the Russians as the other two great powers. Furthermore, Trump, when he comes into office, abandons engagement with China, which was a very liberal policy designed to make China rich and turn it into a liberal democracy on the assumption we would all live happily ever after. It's Trump who ends engagement and adopts containment in this multipolar world, as his administration describes it. Furthermore, as you remember, Trump wanted to have good relations with Russia, with Putin. And if he had succeeded at that, and we had had no NATO expansion into Ukraine, the United States and Russia would have much better relations today than exists. Now, what happened? What happened is that as a result of Russiagate and the power of the deep state, Trump ended up being every bit as antagonistic towards the Russians as his predecessors and his successors. And as we all know, he was the first president to provide offensive arms to the Ukrainians. So what happened with the coming of President Trump to the White House in January 2017 is that we, in a very conspicuous way, moved into a multipolar world, number one. Number two, we put a great deal of emphasis on containing China and abandoning engagement. But with regard to Russia, we continued to push the Ukraine situation to the point where it was guaranteed that the Russians were going to end up allied with the Chinese, which didn't make any sense. So that's the first Trump administration. Then we get the second Trump administration, which of course starts on January 20th of this year. We're clearly in a multipolar world now. There's just no doubt about that. And Trump is interested in containing China, apparently. And it looks like he's interested in improving relations with Putin and with Russia more generally. He looks like in the beginning that he's interested in doing, in his second administration vis-a-vis Russia, what he was unable to do in his first administration. But it doesn't work. He does it in such a ham-fisted way that he makes virtually no progress in settling the Ukraine war. And relations between the United States and Russia, despite appearing better on the surface, are pretty much the same as ever. The Russians don't trust us at all. The Russians are clearly closely allied with the Chinese, and they understand full well that they should remain closely allied with the Chinese. Because the problem with President Trump is that he changes his mind every other day. and you can't trust him. The Indians found that out, as we discussed earlier. The Russians have found that out on countless occasions. They talk to him, they think they have an agreement, and then a couple days later, Trump changes his mind. So the end result of all this is that the Russians and the Chinese, as we were saying before, are as close together as ever. The Indians are now reasonably close to both the Russians and the Chinese because of Trump's foolish policies. So in a very important way, Trump has good instincts, I think. In terms of his basic instincts on the nature of international politics and what our relationship should be with countries like Russia and China. Again, I think his basic instincts are correct. But in terms of execution, he gets a failing grade. And that's why the United States is in so much trouble today.
Well, it seems that all the NATO expansion, it made a lot of sense, I think, in the 1990s, because if there is a unipolar distribution of power, and one pursues this hegemonic peace where you don't have to take into consideration the security of your opponents, rather just make sure you're so dominant that it doesn't really matter what other countries like Russia thinks, then of course it makes sense to expand NATO, because what this entailed was, strengthening the US role in Europe, but also recognizing if Russia would be within this NATO structures, it wouldn't be the same kind of institution that would bring the Americans into Europe. And again, Joe Biden, he made this comment in the Atlantic Council back, I think it was in 1997, where he said, the Russians warned us that if we expand NATO, then they're forced to look towards China as a partner, and then he said, well, I told him, yeah, go ahead. While you're at it, if that doesn't work, you go try to partner with the Iranians. And the whole room just bursts into laughter, because America in the West was the only game in town, and they knew that the worst deal they gave to the Russians was the only deal on the table. And the U.S. Secretary of Defense under Clinton and William Perry made a similar comment that everyone in the administration knew this would alienate the Russians, but it didn't really matter anymore because they were weak. So all of this kind of made sense when there's a unipolar distribution of power. But when expanding this to NATO, and now Russia has the ability to push back and fight, and indeed winning this proxy war against NATO, given the new distribution of power in which we kind of have to recognize, what is the way to rescue the situation now? Because this NATO expansion, which for me gave birth, was good to cement the unipolar moment, and from the 1990s and 2000s, it doesn't really make much sense anymore now that the Russians are capable of, again, the winning on the battlefield, withstanding economic pressures, finding new international partners, strengthening China, which is now the main rival to the United States. What does the political West do in this situation? Because it's very hard to change course now, it seems.
I just want to go back to your comments on the decisions that were made in the 1990s, especially with regard to NATO expansion. Your rhetoric sort of implied that we were thinking in balance of power terms at the time. I think that people like Secretary of Defense Bill Perry, George Kennan, Paul Nitze, and a substantial number of other people, many of whom were quite hawkish during the Cold War, thought of NATO expansion in, I think, balance of power terms. In other words, they thought that if we expanded NATO, the Russians would react, and we would be in real trouble. And the Russians, in their mind, would act according to basic realist logic. And that's why they opposed NATO expansion. But of course, they lost the fight. And the people who dominated the discourse, people like Anthony Lake, Strobe Talbot, and President Clinton himself, did not think in balance of power terms. It's very important to understand that we were not expanding NATO in the 1990s and the first part of the 21st century because we thought Russia was a threat. That kind of rhetoric is dominant in the West now. That was not our view in the 1990s, for sure. Bill Clinton thought that he could expand NATO and create this giant zone of peace that included both Eastern Europe and Western Europe. What he wanted to do was take those institutions that dominated in Western Europe and spread them eastward. He wanted to create a zone of peace, a Europe that was whole and free. he did not view this as anti-Russian. Clinton was fully aware that the Russians would be unhappy, but he thought that he could assuage their fears and that NATO could be expanded and we could live happily ever after. Michael McFaul, who was fully on board with this whole enterprise and was the U.S. ambassador to Moscow at one time, has told me that he told Putin on a number of occasions that NATO expansion was not a threat to Russia. It was not designed to cause problems for Russia. It was designed to make Europe more peaceful. It was only after the crisis broke out on February 22nd, 2014, that we changed the rhetoric and the Russians became dangerous and NATO expansion had to happen to contain these evil Russians. But that's not what was driving thinking about NATO expansion before then. Again, it's very important to understand that this was the period of liberal hegemony. This is when we had these liberal ideas in our head that we thought should dominate how we thought about American foreign policy. And just to switch gears for a second here and drive my point home, you want to understand that the United States played a key role in turning China into a great power. We helped on purpose to fuel Chinese economic growth, allowing China to join the WTO in 2001, which both the Clinton administration and the Bush administration fully supported, really fueled Chinese growth in the early part of this century. And we were doing that on purpose because we thought that if China became really powerful, it would become a democracy. And because democracies don't fight each other and democracies live together happily, that this story would have a happy ending to it. That was our belief. And remember, I told you that it was President Trump, when he became president for the first time in 2017, he was the person who jettisoned or got away from engagement, this policy that was designed to make China rich. And what Trump did was he adopted containment. But we had a fundamentally different view of how to think about dealing with China before 2017. And it was a very liberal approach. It basically believed, let me put it differently, it was basically premised on the assumption that the world had changed and balance of power politics didn't matter anymore, and that the United States could live comfortably, peacefully with a really powerful China, right? And this same logic, again, applied with regard to NATO expansion. The Clinton people were not looking to pick a fight with Russia. As you know better than I do, Glenn, Russia was a military and economic basket case in the 1990s and early 2000s. There was no need to think about containing Russia back then, and that's not what they were doing. They were, in their minds, spreading this liberal regime that existed in Western Europe eastward, and were going to make Europe more peaceful. And of course, it all backfired. It backfired in East Asia. The United States created a peer competitor. Can you believe that? The United States purposely created a powerful China that's now a peer competitor. And in Europe, we pushed NATO expansion on the belief that this would lead to a more peaceful Europe, when it's had exactly the opposite effect.